This series on women in science, technology, and business is brought to you by Zoho Corporation. Zoho is the operating system for business.
Hello, I'm Kamla. My guest today is Rina-Shaikh Lesko. She trained as an epidemiologist and is now a science writer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome to the show, Rina.
Thank you for having me.
Why did you become a science writer?
Well, even when I worked as an epidemiologist, actually since I was a little kid, I had always wanted to be a writer. And at one point, I realized that the best way forward for me was to actually combine my love of science and my love of writing. I used to think that science journalists and science writers lived in this rarefied world that was unreachable for someone like me. And when I realized, I had encouragement from mentors, that it was possible for me to do this work, to actually combine those two things I loved, I jumped for it, and I have loved it ever since.
So you launched on a journey of self-discovery.
Very much so.
Okay. But when you were young, what did you think you would become?
The first thing I had wanted to be was a writer, but my father, who was very pragmatic, said that perhaps I should think of something else for a day job. And so that eventually led me to epidemiology. Which
Is that how he put it, that you should look for a day job, or did he say you should have a steady job?
He said I should have a steady source of income.
Okay. And is your dad an engineer?
He's a quality control engineer, so yes, he comes from a scientific background.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess like a lot of immigrant parents, he worried that perhaps if you didn't have a steady job, you would not have a good life.
Very much so. Ironically, I think, for a lot of women my age, and especially women in my relatively traditional family, being a mother and supporting the family that way was the most important thing. But my dad wanted me to be independent. And for me to be independent financially meant having an income. And to him, being a writer was not a very good way of having an income, basically. And so he thought, something more steady would help me achieve that independence.
Can I ask you why your dad thought that you needed to be an independent, since you mentioned you came from a conservative background, and your mom, I'm guessing, didn't work?
She did, but it was only when our family needed it.
Got you. Okay. So did you ever ask him why he wanted you to be economically or financially independent?
Oh, it was never in doubt. It was a basic fact of life that I grew up with. My father was a generation of Indians who really valued female, I want to say, emancipation. He wanted everything possible for me that a son would have had. And, he was so, he cared so much about me being an individual and apart from the men in my life that he even forewent the Indian tradition of having your father's first name as your middle name. So for a long time, I didn't have a middle name. So
he was a very emancipated man.
Yes, very much so.
Okay. So you wanted to be a writer, but here you are, your dad said you need a job that would be steady and pay your bills. So you veered towards math and science. Were you good at them?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it wasn't just that I was good at them, I enjoyed them. And I couldn't, I remember reading ahead in my textbooks when I was in high school, just because I thought the science was so fascinating.
So it was not a difficult subject for you?
No.
Okay. But you mentioned in a conversation that you and I had that you were a little bit jealous of your mom because she's very good in math.
Yes. Yes. So when you say math and science, that's something I feel comfortable with. But if you break those apart, I definitely feel more comfortable on the science side. Math often felt very abstract to me. And I often had to make it much more concrete in order to understand it. My mother had a fluency with numbers that was astonishing to me. And that was never something I had.
Oh, so the fluency in numbers. Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have good math teachers growing up?
I did. I had some really great math teachers. But I think my approach to math, because I was intimidated by it, I don't know that I was ever able to fully enjoy it the way that I enjoyed science. I had teachers who pushed me to excel, but enjoying the math was a different matter.
Gotcha. So there you were good in the hard sciences and not too bad in math, and you decide to go to college. What did you think you were going to become? I keep coming back to that question because you're a science writer, but it looks like you went through different stages of self-discovery.
I did. I think my first stage of the self-discovery, like a lot of people, was when I went to college. I went to college thinking that I was going to be a doctor.
Oh.
It made sense to me. It was the kind of job that was easy to define. And it was challenging, and it was something that my very competitive high school self wanted to be good at. But when I was in college, I learned that there were so many other areas of exploration. Anthropology, English literature was really hard for me. Even though I loved writing, really thinking critically about literature was hard. I eventually figured it out, but it was tough. History was tough, but there's a lot of really cool stuff that happened in the Middle Ages that I didn't know about. And so it felt like there was this whole world that I could explore that went beyond just what the little pond that I thought that the world was when I was in high school. And I also discovered creative writing, which made my world feel boundless.
So what does an epidemiologist do?
Epidemiologists study diseases, but unlike doctors, they are studying diseases over populations. In other words, they are looking at how groups of people get sick.
So for example, Ebola.
Ebola.
Okay.
So an epidemiologist studying Ebola would be looking at not just who got sick, but when they got sick, how long it took for one set of people to spread the disease to another set of people. So they're looking at time and space in terms of the populations, but time as well. So they're looking at diseases over time. They look at, on an individual level, how one person becomes infected, becomes sick, spreads it to another person. But then they're also looking at the waves of people.
But how do you trace that? How do you trace an infection?
The way that you trace an infection, well, that's a complicated question, but basically you have to depend on how people define a disease. Ebola, as we know it, there's a couple of different ways to track it. When someone becomes sick, you start to suspect that they have a disease like Ebola. They will have a set of symptoms that looks like Ebola, but they may or may not have the actual disease. So you need to take a sample and test do a laboratory test. That's one way to confirm it. The other thing that you can do is you can look at the people in an outbreak, and you can make a pretty good guess that someone who's been exposed to an Ebola case, if they have the same symptoms, is likely to have Ebola.
So there you are sitting at the desk of some hospital, and something has broken infections. How do you, as an epidemiologist, design the study or figure out? That's where I think I'm getting at. How do you find out? Is there a mathematical algorithm on how infections spread?
There is. When you're sitting in a hospital, you're probably not going to be thinking about that algorithm, but over a larger sense, there are algorithms that help epidemiologists understand what to expect in an outbreak. And they
give us an idea what to expect.
So the things that they're going to look at is how quickly an infection spreads, or how quickly someone who is exposed to a virus is likely to become ill, and how quickly that virus can then spread to other people. You also are going to look at how infectious a virus is, or any kind of microbe, and that, for example, Ebola is not very infectious. In other words, if you have...
Oh, it's not?
Compared to a disease like measles, no.
So why did we, I have to stop and ask you, because I remember when the Ebola broke out, they said that even if you touch, because, airports were considered gateways for getting the infection, even if you touch somebody, if you sneezed, you would get Ebola.
Well, so
Where does that come from?
I think that comes from fear about the disease, because the disease, I think sometimes people get confused between how severe a disease is and what it takes to actually catch the disease. For people to catch Ebola, you actually have to be in contact with bodily fluids like blood, or if someone is throwing up, so you have to have a pretty big...
Sneezing?
Not necessarily. It's not airborne. Measles, however, is so infectious that if you sneeze it up, if someone who has measles sneezes it up and they're in a hospital room, measles will stay floating in the air for 3 hours afterward. And so you don't actually have to be in the room with someone to catch measles. You just have to be in the room with someone who had measles, or you just have to go into the same room as someone who had measles. There have been some anecdotes within measles outbreaks of people who were infectious with measles going into an elevator and leaving the elevator, and then someone else who used that same elevator later getting sick with measles.
So there is no...
Ebola doesn't work that way.
What about Zika?
Zika is spread through mosquitoes. So mosquitoes will pick it up from someone.
Any particular kind of mosquito?
It's the Anopheles mosquito.
Okay. So it spreads through mosquitoes?
Yes.
Okay. And so that's how the infection spreads?
Right. So the mosquito has to draw blood from someone who is sick and then go to someone who is not sick and then spread it that way.
Okay. What about vaccination? Because that's something that you hear or read about it quite a bit in the newspapers and see it in media, that there are some parents who don't want their kids vaccinated. What have you discovered through your research? Are there concerns to be, how shall I put it, are there concerns evidence-based? Or is it based on their individual faith, maybe religious or values or...
Right. I would not say that those fears are evidence-based. There has been a lot of research in the past couple of decades looking specifically at how safe vaccines are and whether or not they are linked to some diseases. For example, the MMR shot, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, was connected at one point to autism because of some flawed studies.
It was that study a flawed one?
There was one study by Andrew Wakefield that was eventually retracted, and Wakefield actually lost his license to practice in England because it was found that he was actually used some unethical methods to do this research. Despite the fact that that study has been completely debunked, that idea that his study and that seed that was planted with that study has now flowered, and a lot of people still are suspicious of measles, mumps, rubella because there's still this connection in the general public, even though there have been dozens of studies showing that there is no connection between those two.
So vaccination is one. The other thing that comes to mind is climate change. And you had mentioned that in our previous conversation that a lot of these infections are spreading because humans are going into territories where we haven't gone before.
Right.
And that is, Zika, you said, is one of the infections that has been around, but because humans have gone to these territories that we didn't go before.
Right. That's one of the ways that scientists think that some of these diseases have been spread. Again, this is an area that a lot of scientists are studying just because there's so much we don't know about diseases like Zika. And in a lot of ways, we don't know a lot about the history of even Ebola, of how it spread to people. Or say SARS, that's another one where scientists are still trying to understand how it got from its animal host, in other words, the animal where it sort of lived without harming that animal, and how it jumped to humans. And it's still, because these diseases are complex, it's not an easy answer. When you mention climate change, the disease that comes to mind is cholera, because...
And what is cholera?
Cholera is a disease that causes diarrhea, really severe diarrhea and dehydration.
And you get it from water?
It is spread through water.
Infected water?
Infected water. It's caused by a bacteria, Vibrio cholerae, and it's common in rivers and along shallow shorelines, because there are animals that live in the water that basically play host to this. As you know, as the climate is changing, those waterways are changing. There are also more risks of flooding, and that flooding can lead to contaminated water, water that can be contaminated with cholera. So there are a lot of ways that cholera is more likely as climate change continues.
So it's a direct upshot of climate change.
Yeah.
In some ways. Do you think there is climate change? Because there are, again, people that say there is no climate change. So since you're a science writer, what has evidence shown you?
It's funny that you asked that question, because I don't think there are any scientists who are seriously studying climate change that doubt that it's happening.
Oh.
I think the evidence that the temperatures that have scientists have been following for decades, and also evidence from studies of ice cores in the Antarctic, and I believe the Arctic as well, tell us a lot about the climate in ancient times. And right now, there are parts of the Earth that are the hottest that they have ever been.
Like?
Unfortunately, this isn't an area that I know as well as I should, so I can't answer that question very well.
Okay. So that is one. There's also something that you mentioned, or I think you probably wrote an article about how blood types lead us to develop, should I say, diseases, or...
That's one way of looking at it. That's actually an article that I have not yet written, but it is a fact of...
But you're thinking of writing?
That I am suddenly... I had just learned about this a little while ago, and I'm fascinated by it. Because there are some diseases that your blood type will affect how likely you are to get really sick and die from it. Malaria is one. Malaria hits people who are type A blood type the hardest. Cholera, which we just talked about, affects people who are type O hardest. And scientists are now beginning to understand the biochemistry at the cellular level of how those microbes are interacting with human cells, and how our blood type is making a difference. And it has to do with markers on our cells. So
do you think, so if I was to ask you, hypothetically speaking, if a certain community was living by a river, would their blood cells or blood type evolve over the years if they lived for generations in the same place?
That's a very good question. In fact, there are parts of India, on the border of India and Bangladesh, of the Ganges Delta, where cholera is thought to have originated. And that group actually has fewer people with type O blood type than other parts of the world. And scientists speculate that that's because the people living in that area have co-evolved with the cholera bacteria.
So that means those who were with blood O were phased out in some way.
Essentially.
I mean, that sounds brutal, but
It does, but that's essentially what happened. So that, generations ago, if you were type O, you were more likely to die before you had kids. And essentially the cholera bacteria wiped out people with type O blood in that area.
that means this is a very fascinating field to explore. That is, if there are traditional societies staying put in a certain part of a geographical area, maybe they're a good a source to understand certain diseases and how they dealt with them. Is that a right way of framing it?
I think so, and that is one of the ways that epidemiologists will look at disease patterns over time, is that they will look at groups that have basically lived the same way for many years or many centuries, and use those as a proxy for how people used to live, before different kinds of civilization developments happened, or different kinds of technological developments happened.
So in today's world, we move around so much. Does that mean that the probability of infections spreading is far higher today than it was before?
Absolutely. It's, most of the world is just a plane ride away, and there are a lot of plane rides. So, the fear that Ebola would come to the U.S. was very real, because it was literally a day's plane ride away. However, despite that, we have a pretty good public health system that jumped into action when there were people who came, when there was a case, or when there were people who were suspected to have Ebola. And the problem really is when there are diseases that we don't understand well, when there are diseases that either are unknown to us, that are new, or diseases that we don't understand very well. That's, I think, what really scares epidemiologists and scientists who study these new diseases.
Have you ever been scared?
About a disease?
Yeah.
Yeah, when my children were very young, it was about the time that there was the Disneyland outbreak of measles, and they were too young to get the vaccine, but we had to travel, and so we were in an airport, and I didn't want to fly because I don't know that was an entirely rational fear, but knowing how infectious measles can be, and knowing how often measles can be spread in places like airports where there are people coming from many different parts of the world, I was definitely nervous about it.
What precautions do you take when you're traveling, especially by plane?
We are very careful to wash our hands, which I think is one of the best things you can do to keep yourself safe from infectious diseases. We always make sure we are up to date on our vaccinations. We're careful about what we eat. In other words, there are a lot of diseases that are spread through your food. So not only when we get to the place that we're going, a lot of places you can't eat the food because you're going to get traveler's diarrhea. But even when you're traveling in an airport, I feel like it's very careful. You have to be careful of the people around you, because you don't know what people might have. And I think that I don't know that that's a precaution I would necessarily tell people, like don't eat in an airport is not necessarily advice I would give.
Do you eat though?
Yes, you do have to eat, especially on those international flights. But I would say the advice I would give is basically be up to date on your vaccines, and wash your hands, because
But now they say
important.
don't wash your hand because there's the new theory that being ultra clean has led to all these allergies.
That's right.
So, you're in a catch-22 situation. Do you wash your hands or you don't wash your hands?
Well, those are two different things in my mind. I think the idea is not necessarily not to wash your hands, but to be careful what you wash your hands with.
So,
So I would avoid antibacterial soap.
and use?
Regular old soap and water. Antibacterial soap is more likely to lead to that sense of overly clean. Your body has a healthy microbiome. It has you're always going to have bacteria on your body. But what you're trying to avoid are bacteria like the flu virus or cold viruses. And washing your hands regularly will keep you from getting those things on your face and getting those into your body. Your hands are basically the way those germs get in because you're touching things that might have those things on them.
My final question, what advice would you give to someone who wants to become a science writer?
That's a great question. I would say that the best thing is to find science that makes you really excited and write about it. You can write on a blog. You can seek out small outlets. It always pays to reach out to editors. I know even at the national publications, editors love to hear from new voices. Part of the job of an editor is to find great new voices. And so it's important to reach out to them as a writer. There are a lot of really great resources of books out there. There are also many groups that you can join. Most universities, if you're a student, or a lot of universities have groups that are about science writing. But again, I come back to just write about the science that you love. Put it down on paper.
So unleash the inner creativity in you.
Absolutely.
So that's what you've done.
Yes.
And you're happy.
I'm the happiest I've ever been, yes.
Rina, what a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk to us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And if you missed any of our shows, you can watch them on our YouTube channel or visit our website, kamlashow.com. And we'll be back again next week with another edition of our show. Until then, goodbye.
This series on women in science, technology, and business is brought to you by Zoho Corporation. Zoho is the operating system for business.